An Arado Ar-234 tore over the Allied lines in Normandy at roughly 460 miles per hour, stopping soldiers in their tracks. Radar couldn't lock onto it. Guns couldn't track it. Fighters couldn't climb fast enough to reach it. In the summer of 1944, Germany was losing the war on every front, but somehow they'd been operating this new jet bomber in secret for months. The aircraft could photograph any target in Europe without risk of interception, drop bombs, and be gone before a defense could be organized. It was one of Hitler's wonder weapons that actually worked, which makes what happened next even harder to explain. By 1940, German air defenses were already struggling to stop British reconnaissance aircraft from crossing into occupied Europe, photographing their targets, and returning before fighters could intercept them. The aircraft sent to stop these intruders usually carried guns or relied on escorts, but both measures added weight and cut into speed. The limitations had already become obvious in the early years of the war, when German radar stations and coastal observation posts often detected incoming reconnaissance aircraft, prompting fighter units to scramble to intercept them. Pilots climbed quickly in Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, attempting to reach the altitude of the intruder before it reached its target. But in many cases, they arrived too late. The reconnaissance aircraft had already crossed the objective, exposed its cameras, and begun the return flight toward Britain. Each successful flight brought back clear photographs of Germany's defenses and infrastructure, which Allied planners used to shape bombing targets and operational plans across the European theater. Those flights showed that Germany was no longer dictating the terms of every air encounter. British reconnaissance aircraft crossed defended airspace on their own schedule, completing their work and leaving before interceptors could stop them. The slightly faster piston-engine aircraft would not be enough against it. If Germany wanted to keep flying deep reconnaissance missions, it needed an aircraft fast enough to stay beyond the reach of enemy interceptors. Late in 1940, the Reich Air Ministry formally opened a competition for a new type of aircraft, a jet-powered reconnaissance machine. The specification required long-range, high-altitude performance and sufficient internal space to carry large quantities of fuel. The aircraft would need to travel roughly 2,000 kilometers to conduct deep reconnaissance missions and return safely. Instead of defensive armament, the design would rely on speed to avoid interception. On paper, this was exactly the kind of aircraft Germany needed. While most air forces still depended on piston-engine bombers and reconnaissance planes, the new requirement pointed towards something far more ambitious, a jet aircraft that could cross defended airspace so quickly that interception itself became doubtful. If it worked, the Luftwaffe would have an aircraft operating beyond the reach of the fighters and reconnaissance planes then flying over Europe. But jet propulsion was still experimental technology, which led aircraft manufacturers to hesitate to commit to a project built around engines that were still under development. In the end, only one company submitted a complete proposal, Arado Flugzeugwerke. As it turned out, they had already been studying a jet-powered reconnaissance concept that matched the ministry's requirements. The new reconnaissance requirement pushed Arado's engineers toward a very different kind of aircraft. Under the leadership of engineer Walter Blum, the design team refined its concept into an aircraft optimized for range and speed. That emphasis on speed showed up immediately in the aircraft's shape. Its surfaces were sleek and clean to reduce drag, and the entire design aimed at high-speed flight over long distances. Arado intended it to cross defended airspace at an altitude and speed that would leave defending fighters too little time to climb, locate it, and attack. At a time when most air forces still relied on piston-engine reconnaissance aircraft, this was a far more ambitious approach. Instead of surviving through gun positions, armor protection, or escort fighters, the new aircraft would survive by finishing its mission before interception could be organized. Rather than using a conventional metal cockpit section, Arado gave the aircraft a broad, glazed nose. The pilot sat at the front, inside this transparent enclosure, with a clear forward view during reconnaissance runs. Cameras mounted in the fuselage behind him recorded the target area as the aircraft passed overhead. Without machine guns, ammunition, or turret positions in the forward fuselage, the nose remained smooth and uncluttered. Yet speed was only part of the equation. Range mattered just as much, since reconnaissance missions could carry the aircraft deep into enemy territory, so the aircraft needed enough fuel to reach its target, complete the photographic run, and return safely. Engineers devoted much of the fuselage behind the cockpit to fuel tanks, giving the aircraft the range the Air Ministry wanted, but leaving little room inside for a normal landing gear. That forced Arado toward one of the aircraft's strangest features, an unusual takeoff and landing arrangement. For takeoff, the aircraft rested on a detachable three-wheeled trolley, known as a Bureaucratic. This wheeled carriage supported the aircraft during the takeoff roll, then was jettisoned once the aircraft lifted clear of the runway, allowing it to fall back to the airfield for recovery and reuse. On landing, the aircraft came down on a retractable central skid beneath the fuselage, supported by smaller skids under the engine nacelles. The system reduced weight and avoided carving up the fuselage with landing gear bays already crowded with fuel tanks. By then, the design had moved far beyond anything resembling a conventional reconnaissance aircraft. The company was now developing a jet-powered machine built to cross defended airspace without escort and leave it before interceptors could react. The design now had its official name, Arado Ar-234. Within months, the first prototypes were already taking shape. Despite all that progress, the aircraft still could not take off. The entire design depended on the Junkers UMO-4 turbojet, but in 1941, it remained unreliable and difficult to manufacture because Germany lacked the heat-resistant metals needed for durable turbine parts. Even so, the project appeared to have strong initial support. On October 24, 1941, Arado's design was accepted for production, and the Reich Air Ministry placed a request for 50 aircraft. For a moment, the aircraft seemed to be moving forward at exactly the right time. Instead, engineers replaced scarce high-temperature alloys with cheaper substitutes, including aluminum-coated mild steel in the hot section, and chromador steel alloy turbine blades. Those materials enabled production, but they also shortened engine life under heat and strain. That left the Ar-234 in a difficult position. Its airframe was taking shape, but the engines it depended on were still too fragile and scarce to test the aircraft in flight. At the same time, the program lost one of its strongest supporters. In November 1941, General Oberst Ernst Udet, head of the Air Ministry and a major backer of the project, passed away. His replacement, Erhard Mirsch, preferred proven aircraft types and showed far less enthusiasm for risky new designs. For a time, the future of the Ar-234 was genuinely in doubt. That hesitation eased only after Milch visited the Arado plant and was impressed enough to allow development to continue into 1942. To make matters worse, Arado was also competing for the same engines with a more urgent program. Messerschmitt's Me-262 fighter had become a priority because German leaders hoped a jet interceptor could break up Allied bomber attacks over the Reich. In that contest for scarce engines, the fighter came first. The Arado 234, designed for reconnaissance, had to wait. So the aircraft remained on the ground for several months while the war moved on without it. Mechanics could inspect it and its test systems, preparing it for the day usable engines finally arrived, but they could not send it into the air. What had looked like a breakthrough now depended on an industrial and technical base that Germany was struggling to provide. At the same time, other countries were also working on combat jets, but none had yet solved the same engineering problems. In Britain, the Gloucester Meteor was still moving through development and had not yet entered service. In the United States, early jet work was underway, but American designs were still far from combat use. Germany had moved early, but that lead solved nothing on its own. Engine reliability, scarce materials, and weak production still stood in the way, and no air force had yet made jet propulsion decisive in combat. The Ar-234 had been designed from the start around 2 UMO-4 engines, but Arado did not begin receiving usable examples until February 1943. About 8 months after Messerschmitt had received the same engines for the Me-262. Even then, most serviceable UMO-4s still went to Messerschmitt, leaving Arado with only a thin and irregular supply. And the engines that did arrive were not always reliable enough for sustained flight testing, which forced Arado to wait longer for examples fit for serious trials. It wasn't until June 15, 1943, that the Ar-234 finally left the ground. By this time, more than 2 years had passed. What had once looked like a possible answer to Germany's reconnaissance problem was already being pushed toward a war that was moving against it. Even after that first flight, the program remained fragile. By September 1943, 4 prototypes were undergoing flight tests. Then, on October 2, 1943, the second prototype crashed after engine and instrumentation failures. Flugkapitän Zell was lost when Arado Ar 234 V2 crashed. Even so, when the aircraft entered serious flight testing, it immediately showed why so much effort had gone into the project. Once the engines reached power, the aircraft accelerated beyond the performance of the reconnaissance and bomber aircraft then serving in Europe. Test pilots found that it climbed well, remained steady in level flight, and maintained its speed at altitude in a way piston engine aircraft could not match. For a Luftwaffe still flying conventional bombers and reconnaissance planes, the difference was clear. At a time when Britain and the United States were still trying to turn their own jet projects into usable military aircraft, Arado now had a machine in the air that pointed toward what the next generation of combat aircraft might look like. And yet, the excitement didn't last long. The same tests that proved the aircraft's potential also exposed one of its most serious weaknesses. Arado's original takeoff and landing system soon proved difficult and dangerous in practice. One pilot later described the sensation of landing an AR-234 as, quote, like sliding on soap. Once the skids touched the runway, the pilot had far less control than in a wheeled aircraft. Braking was limited, steering was poor, and even a slightly misaligned approach could send the aircraft sliding across the airfield, with little chance of regaining control. On a crowded wartime runway, that was a serious operational danger. German airfields were already under pressure from heavy use, shortages, and the growing threat of Allied attack. An aircraft that skidded badly, blocked a runway, or took too long to recover could disrupt the entire field. Arado responded by redesigning the aircraft with conventional tricycle landing gear. That change required reworking parts of the fuselage to accommodate retractable wheels and their supporting structure. It added weight and reduced some of the original concept's simplicity, but it made the aircraft much more practical. The redesigned aircraft became the Arado Ar-234B, a version far better suited for regular operations, but it came at a cost. Every change needed to make the aircraft usable pushed it further down the calendar and closer to a stage of the war in which Germany had less and less time to benefit from it. Around the time the AR-234 was entering pre-production and operational testing, Allied forces landed in Normandy. It was June 1944, and the Western Front had become a massive logistics operation. Thousands of vehicles, aircraft, and supply convoys were moving across northern France. German commanders urgently needed accurate information about the buildup behind Allied lines. Conventional reconnaissance aircraft had become increasingly vulnerable over Normandy. Allied fighters patrolled the skies above the invasion front, while anti-aircraft guns protected supply depots, airfields, and transport routes. The slow reconnaissance plane could easily be intercepted before it finished its mission. The AR-234 answered that problem with speed. Flying higher and faster than most interceptors could reach in time, it could cross the front, take its photographs, and leave before Allied fighters could close the distance. So on August 2, 1944, an AR-234 prototype made history as the first jet aircraft to carry out a reconnaissance mission. Piloted by Lieutenant Erich Zomer, the aircraft climbed to altitude and crossed the Normandy front at high speed. As it passed over the target area, its 2 RB-5030 cameras began photographing the ground below at 11-second intervals. Frame by frame, the film recorded the invasion beaches, temporary airfields, supply depots, and long columns of trucks sustaining the Allied advance. Now the aircraft finally demonstrated the advantage at the heart of the entire project. Along the Normandy shore, Allied troops reportedly saw it rip overhead at roughly 460 miles per hour. Interceptors were sent up, but the effort rarely got far. By the time Allied fighters climbed to the right altitude and reached the reported sector, the jet had already crossed the target area and turned away. When it returned, it brought back some of the clearest images German intelligence had yet obtained of the invasion front. Analysts could trace supply routes feeding the Allied armies, identify aircraft dispersal areas cut into open fields, and spot new airstrips supporting tactical air units in France. The mission showed how quickly Allied strength was building after the landings. It also proved the aircraft's value while exposing the limits that would follow it for the rest of the war. After this success, the Arado Ar-234 took on further reconnaissance sorties across Western Europe, but in the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had only a handful, likely no more than 6. Even so, the demand for intelligence continued to grow. German commanders needed fresh photographs of the buildup behind Allied lines. They needed to see the ports, the airfields, the roads, and the rail lines carrying the war into France. That meant the AR-234 needed to cross the Channel again and again. It began flying toward the south coast of Britain, where German intelligence watched ports, anchorages, and staging areas for signs of the next Allied move. Many of these sorties focused on harbors, airfields, and staging areas along the south coast of Britain, where shipping concentrations, runway expansion, and vehicle traffic revealed how quickly Allied strength was building. Other flights turned toward the Netherlands, where German commanders feared another landing and wanted a warning before it came. When Allied defenses detected it, fighters were sent up, but speed and altitude usually decided the chase before it had fully begun. By the time they reached the correct altitude and sector, the AR-234 had often already crossed the target and turned away. Even when pilots saw it ahead of them, sight was not the same as range. Most pursuits ended the same way. Some reports described AR-234 pilots deliberately exploiting that speed margin. Instead of breaking away immediately, they sometimes let pursuing Allied fighters draw close enough for the chase to seem possible, before pushing the throttles forward. The jet did not leap ahead instantly, but as engine power built, the aircraft began to pull away in level flight. What looked like a closing pursuit quickly turned into a widening gap. With the Spitfires, Mustangs, or Thunderbolts behind it, that usually ended the chase. They could follow the same line through the sky, but they could not match the AR-234's sustained speed well enough to bring it into gun range. The aircraft had already proven its value, but by late 1944, Germany needed more than photographs. Allied armies were advancing across Western Europe, and the Luftwaffe needed aircraft capable of attacking targets directly. Under mounting pressure, German leaders forced the AR-234 into a bombing role. However, the aircraft was not designed for that mission. Its fuselage had been packed with fuel to provide the range required for long reconnaissance flights, leaving no space for a conventional internal bomb bay. If bombs were to be carried at all, they would have to be mounted externally. Arado's engineers answered with racks fitted beneath the fuselage and under the engine nacelles. This allowed the aircraft to carry a bomb load of up to 1,500 kilograms without a complete redesign. External bombs increased drag and reduced speed, cutting into the very advantage that had made the aircraft valuable. Even so, Germany was now preparing something no other air force had yet put into combat: a jet bomber. The aircraft was assigned to Kampfgeschwader 76. By December 1, 1944, the unit had only 51 AR-234s on strength. However, not all those aircraft were serviceable at once. The UMO-4 engine still demanded constant attention. After roughly 10 hours of flying, they often needed a major overhaul. By around 25 hours, many had to be replaced outright. That problem grew worse as Germany's industrial position deteriorated. High-grade materials were scarce, substitute metals wore out quickly, and fuel itself was often both limited and poor in quality. The aircraft would reach the battlefield at extraordinary speed, but keeping it ready for repeated combat sorties was another matter. Even within those limits, the first jet bomber mission took place on December 24th. That day, 9 AR-234B2s from 3rd KG-76 struck transport and industrial targets in Belgium and the Namur Liege area. German planners were trying to hit the roads and rail lines that kept the Allied armies moving. If Germany could cut those routes even briefly, it could slow the pressure building against the Western Front. But the bombing run itself exposed the main weakness of trying to convert the AR-234 into an attacker. The aircraft was equipped with a periscope bomb sight for high-speed level bombing. With it, the pilot had to stabilize the aircraft, line up the target through the sight, and release at exactly the right moment. In practice, that meant that against a rail line, a yard, or a road junction, even a small error in timing or alignment could leave the target still functioning after the bombs fell. That same weakness followed the AR-234 into the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. On December 26th, and again on the 31st, AR-234s attacked Allied troop concentrations around Liege and Bastogne, the kind of targets the aircraft had been converted to attack. They reached those targets quickly, dropped their bombs, and often got away before Allied fighters could close. And yet, those attacks never amounted to more than local damage and temporary disruption. The Luftwaffe had put a jet bomber into combat before anyone else, but it still could not generate enough aircraft, enough bomb weight, or enough accurate hits to change the course of the campaign. Its speed was real, but it protected the aircraft only under the right conditions. By early 1945, Allied pilots had learned that chasing an AR-234 in level flight was usually pointless. Their better chance was to catch one near an airfield or force it into maneuvering flight. Part of the problem lay in the nature of early jet propulsion. The UMO-4 engines did not respond to throttle changes as quickly as a piston fighter's engine, and acceleration was less immediate at lower speeds. If a pilot had to brake hard or change direction suddenly, the aircraft lost the clean, fast profile which usually protected it. Such a weakness was exposed in combat in March 1945, during the fighting around Remagen, a town in the Rhine, where American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge and established the first major Allied bridgehead across the river into central Germany. If that crossing could be destroyed quickly, it might still slow the Allied advance into the Reich. German commanders threw everything they had at it, including artillery, conventional bombers, and even V-2 rockets, but the crossing held. As American engineers strengthened the bridgehead and more troops poured across the Rhine, the Luftwaffe turned to the fastest bomber left in its arsenal, the Arado Ar-234. From above, the Ludendorff Bridge was unmistakable. The AR-234s came in fast, carrying 1,000-kilogram bombs, but speed alone did not solve the problem behind them. To improve their chances, crews came in lower, exposing themselves to concentrated American flak while trying to hold the span in sight for a few seconds longer. The jets crossed the target area at high speed, while shell bursts filled the air around them. Pilots had to steady the aircraft, align the narrow span through the bomb site, and release at exactly the right moment. Their bombs fell near the bridge, in the river, and on the approaches. Not one scored the direct hit needed to destroy the span. Yet again, over Remagen, the same speed that made interception hard also made precise bombing brutally difficult. The attacks continued, while American engineers strengthened the bridgehead and built additional crossings, including pontoon bridges. On March 14th, Captain Don Bryan, flying a P-51 Mustang, was returning from an escort mission when he spotted an AR-234 making a run against the bridgehead. Rather than trying to chase it at a straight line, Bryan maneuvered into position for an interception as the jet completed its attack. When the AR-234 passed through his line, Bryan closed in from behind, opened fire, and shot it down. Bryan said at the fatal confrontation, quote, "I don't know what the hell was on his mind, but he should have gotten out of that airplane while he was high enough. I think he was afraid I would shoot at him and his parachute, which I would never do." The encounter showed that even the AR-234 could be brought down once its path became fixed. Over 6 days of attacks, Kampfgeschwader 76 lost 7 AR-234s, 2 of them to Allied fighters, with the remaining losses coming amid intense anti-aircraft fire and the strain of repeated operations over the bridgehead. 10 days later, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way. The structure collapsed into the Rhine on March 17th, taking with it the lives of 28 American engineers who were still working to strengthen the span. By then, the decisive moment had already passed. Thousands of Allied troops and large quantities of equipment had crossed the Rhine, and the bridgehead was secure. The AR-234 had proven its speed. What Germany lacked was the ability to use that speed with enough strength to change anything. For the remaining Arado AR-234 units, the war lasted only a few final weeks, and by then, even keeping the aircraft in service had become a struggle. A late war inventory, dated April 10, 1945, recorded only 38 AR-234s still in service. Some crews still flew isolated reconnaissance and bombing sorties, but the effort had shrunk to scattered missions with little effect on the fighting. As Allied armies overran one airfield after another, surviving AR-234s were abandoned where they stood or flown north in hopes of keeping them out of enemy hands. At Stavanger, 9 AR-234s fell into British hands, and Allied technical teams moved quickly to secure them for study. By war's end, roughly 250 AR-234s had been built, including prototypes and pre-production aircraft. Only a small number ever saw combat, and even fewer were operational at the same time. Today, only one AR-234 survives, preserved at the Smithsonian Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles. It stands as a reminder that Germany had reached the battlefield with a jet bomber before anyone else, but reached it too late, and in a war already slipping out of its hands.